Hi, welcome back to Cubs and Culture for January 12th, 2018. Continuing my sort of bitching about the way in which statistics are used in baseball. Okay, so the thing about statistics is they're all measuring something. And the issue is, and one of my biggest pet peeves is so many times people make illicit assumptions about, because the thing that you're measuring says X, that therefore Y follows from it. And my biggest pet peeve is, I just was reading on Fangraphs about this, is the leverage index measuring how exciting a game is, or because you can, of course, take multiple because of how many series are played. We also know leverage index of you can buy individual games, how they play out. So, like, for example, in 2016, at one point, the Cubs only had a roughly 10% chance of winning the series after game when they lost the game 7-2, game 4. Anyway, so this is the image you're looking at is my very rough rendering of the leverage index of Game 7 of the World Series, where the middle line is a 50-50 chance of winning the game, and the other line is the win probability of either the Cubs or the Indians. So, of course, if the Cubs have a greater chance of winning the winning the game, the Indians have a less of a chance. So the closer the line gets to one side or the other is which team has the greater chance of winning. So, in Game 7, Fowler hit the home run, but it's a one-inning run, blah, blah, blah. And then then the Indians tied it up, and then the Cubs built a lead, then Rajai Davis tied it up, and then things. So that's roughly the sort of shape it went through. So that's so that's just an example of the leverage index, a rough rendering of it. So what it measures is win probability across time. Now, of course, the win probability changes per game. So this is a very rough rendering, because the actual preciseness of the leverage index is not what I'm interested in. Off Game 5 of the 2017 World Series, where the fucking Dodgers built a lead and the Astros tied it up, then they built a lead and the Astros tied it up, then the Astros built a lead, then the Dodgers held it up, and then eventually the Astros walked them off. Okay, so that's what I mean by leverage index. Now, the thing is, these are used get to measure win probability. Now, it's somewhat, and because it's an ongoing thing, because baseball offensive, or the way in which the game plays out, changes depending on the era. So, for example, back in the dead ball era, which was 1900 to about 1920, you needed to hit 3 singles to score a run, because home runs were very, very low, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you got a 1-run lead in the first inning, that is so much safer in the dead ball era than today because of home runs. Okay, so these things are context specific, so they're designed to measure win probability and how the game is playing out through time. Now, which is fine, and it's good. It's really good at doing that. What's not good is sabermeticians will routinely say that when they're talking about, okay, so one of the things about the leverage index in total is games are getting flatter. Meaning, instead of having crazy up and down or swings of momentum like that, or it being like that the games are getting more, like the number of times the leads are changing hand is getting small, getting less often as compared to like the 70s. So the leverage index is getting flatter. You also have the proliferation of the 3 true outcomes: home run, walk, and strikeout, which also has a tendency to make the leverage index flatter. So the thing that bothers me, and sort of the argument that happens, is Game 5 versus Game 7 for the Cubs versus Game 5 for the Astros. Those are two of the very best baseball games I have ever seen, especially for postseason. What annoys me is several mathematicians, 538 was one of the ones who came up who said this is, well, Game 5 was obviously the more exciting game. That they're making the argument that because the leverage index is getting flatter today, baseball as a whole is getting less exciting. Except the leverage index doesn't actually measure incitement. It measures win probability. Excitement is an emotion or a feeling that is in the individual spectator. So obviously, like, fandom can influence how you feel about it. So, like, obviously, as a Cubs fan, Game 7 will always be the most exciting game for Cubs fans for at least 50, 60 years. Okay? But apart from that, if you look at the two things, you can argue that Game 5 wasn't Game 5 for the Astros and Dodgers wasn't exciting. It was exhausting because the lead changed hands so many times, or they tied it up so many times, and it seemed to take forever because the game was one of the longest games in history. Again, it's a great game. I'm not really complaining about the game. I'm complaining about the assumption or the illicit argument that because the leverage index has this type of line, or it has this many times changing the hands, that we can therefore say this game was more exciting than this game, because it doesn't actually measure that. What it's measuring is the win probability. So what you should say is Game 5 had more had more changes in win probability than Game 7. Okay, so the reason why I'm pointing this out is I think this is a really easy example of a game which would have an extremely flat leverage index. That would be probably the most exciting game you can possibly think of, which is to have two pitchers locked into a great pitcher's duel where each of them were pitching a perfect game. Now, this has happened for no one. There's never been two people who've thrown a perfect game together. Okay, there has been several people who have thrown no hitters together. Like, two people got locked into no hitters. So if perfect is throwing you off, to switch to no hitters. Okay, where for the 27th out of the home pitch for the away pitcher, the guy hits a home run and finally breaks through with a home run. So one good person would have pitched a perfect game, and the one person would have pitched a near perfect game where the only thing he gave up was a home run at the last possible second. The leverage index would look roughly like this. Because, again, as I said, there's some structural advantage depending on the inning because it's easier for the home team, but it would basically be a flat line of 50-50 chance, maybe switching a little bit, and then at the end it would shoot to one. That's an incredibly flat leverage index. But that would be one of the most exciting games. Okay, so a lot of the times when people complain, or a lot of the things that really bothers me is statistics aren't measuring what people try to apply them to, with sabermeticians, 538, etc., wanting to say the leverage index is a way of measuring excitement, and when in fact it is not. Likewise, WAR, which I'm going to spend a lot more time on the next one. WAR doesn't measure anything other than value. It doesn't measure talent. It doesn't measure fame. It measures value. Okay, so the one statistic that really does bother me on this line of thought of people trying to say it doesn't actually measure that is perceived velocity. Perceived velocity is a derived statistic of how fast a ball is traveling, with calculations depending on the release point and angle of the pitcher. So someone like Aroldis Chapman throws 100 on average, but because he's a big, tall, lanky guy and he has such a high release point, allegedly the ball looks faster to the batter, so his perceived velocity, when you go put it to the calculation, often comes back at like 102. The problem with this argument, or the problem with the statistic, is there's not an objective perceived velocity. If you put me in a batter's box and have Hendricks, Arrieta, and Chapman throw, I probably could not tell the difference how fast they were throwing, and I would probably say, especially for or if you throw if you have Chapman, I'll just say 100 the entire time. Likewise, there are what's perceived is not in. It's only in the mind of the observer. So perceived velocity, whatever the fuck that number is, it's not actually what it says it is. It's not It's not how fast it appears to the batter, because how fast it appears to the batter changes on the fucking changes because of the fucking batter. Even the fucking day, I guarantee there are times when Anthony Rizzo was facing Aroldis Chapman where his fastball was objectively 100 and its perceived velocity was still 102. But if you asked Anthony Rizzo how fast Aroldis Chapman was throwing that day, he would say 104, or he was throwing faster, or whatever. Okay, so this thing about perceived velocity does not exist. You can't measure it based on the arm angle. The only way you can measure it's a psychological thing. Perceived velocity exists in the mind of the batter. So the only way you can figure out how fast it appears to someone is not to measure it, but to fucking ask them. Okay, I'm getting really ranty. Perceived velocity really does bother me. Okay, I'll be back with my bit about war in a moment.